Black ships in Edo Bay. On July 8, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Edo Bay with 4 American warships and anchors near Uraga. Tokugawa officials row out in small boats, and they see black smoke, iron hulls, and cannons aimed calmly toward the shore. Perry brings a letter from President Millard Fillmore and a message that feels less like a request and more like a deadline. Japan has spent more than 2 centuries trying to control the outside world by keeping it outside. Foreign ships are watched, trade is limited, and the shogunate holds the keys. Now those keys are being forced loose, not with poetry or diplomacy, but with steam power and gun decks. The scene is quiet, but the fear is loud. You can picture maps unrolled on tatami mats, messengers sprinting between castles, and older men trying to buy time while younger men argue about pride. The pressure builds through the winter, and on March 31, 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa opens ports and begins a new era of contact. This is the first pivot, not because Japan wanted it, but because Japan realizes it must change fast, or be changed by someone else, and from that moment the country starts rebuilding itself like a ship being refitted while it is already at sea. Meiji turns a country inside out. On January 3, 1868, power shifts in the name of the emperor, and the Meiji era begins its hard reset. This is not a soft reform, it is a demolition and rebuild. Old domains and old ranks lose their grip, and the state starts pulling decisions into the center like a fist closing. If you want a simple image, think of a nation turning its face toward the world and refusing to blink. Rail lines spread, factories rise, schools expand, uniforms replace clan colors. The government talks about learning from abroad, then sends people to study, then brings back blueprints for institutions, law, and war. A key change lands on January 10, 1873, with conscription, and suddenly, the right to carry weapons stops being a samurai identity and becomes a national obligation. The modern army is not just a tool, it is an idea, and it teaches discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty to the state. This transformation creates power and anxiety at the same time. A modern economy needs resources. A modern army needs fuel, steel, and secure supply lines. Japan begins to look outward, not only with curiosity but with calculation, and the next decades will prove to Japan that it can fight and win against neighbors and even against empires. Wars that proved Japan could win. In the 1890s, Japan tests its new strength, and the results change its self-image. The First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895 is not only about territory, it is about status. Victory signals that modernization worked, and it also delivers influence, leverage, and a taste for what power can buy. Less than a decade later, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905 pushes that lesson into the global spotlight. You can picture naval guns flashing at night, cold seas, and telegrams racing across continents as newspapers struggle to explain what just happened. An Asian power has defeated a European empire in a major modern war, and that shakes old assumptions far beyond Japan. Inside Japan, these victories feed a dangerous confidence. If the state can win wars, then war starts to look like a solution instead of a disaster. The military grows in prestige, and politics begins to orbit it. The idea spreads that security depends on expansion, and expansion depends on force. At the same time, Japan watches the world carve up spheres of influence, and it does not want to be carved. It wants its own buffer zones, its own markets, its own strategic depth. That logic, once accepted, does not stay contained. It moves to the peninsula closest to Japan, and it becomes policy. Korea becomes the empire's test case. Korea becomes the front line where influence turns into control. By the early 1900s, Japan tightens its grip, and on August 22, 1910, the annexation treaty is sealed, with implementation published days later. On paper, it is administration. In real life, it is the start of decades of colonial rule that reshape language, land, and everyday life. If you want a visual anchor, imagine schoolrooms where the curriculum changes, street signs rewritten, and local institutions replaced by imperial ones. Control is built through police, courts, economic policy, and constant pressure to conform. Colonial rule also creates resistance, and resistance is met with crackdowns, arrests, and the slow grinding effect of living under a state that does not see you as equal. This period matters because it sets a pattern. Japan learns how to run an empire, how to extract, how to suppress dissent, and how to justify it as modernization or stability. The language of development becomes a mask that hides coercion, and the machinery that works in Korea becomes a template used elsewhere. When the world economy tightens and resources feel scarce, that machinery is pointed north and west toward Manchuria, and then deeper into China, and the logic of expansion begins to outrun civilian control. Manchuria and the road to China. On September 18, 1931, a small explosion near a railway line becomes the spark for a major invasion. The Mukden incident is used as pretext, and Japanese forces move fast, taking Manchuria and helping establish the puppet state of Manchukuo. The key detail is not only what happens on the ground, but what happens in Tokyo, where the military's initiative begins to outrun the government's ability to restrain it. You can picture a map where borders turn into arrows, rail hubs become targets, cities become administrative prizes. Behind the scenes, factions inside the military argue about strategy, but they agree on direction. Japan needs resources, land, and leverage. It also fears encirclement and dependence, especially on oil and raw materials that come from abroad. Tension with China escalates until another night becomes a doorway into full-scale war. On July 7, 1937, an incident near the Marco Polo Bridge turns into open conflict. The fighting expands rapidly, and with it expands the strain on discipline, the pressure for quick victories, and the brutalization that often follows prolonged occupation. This is where the story darkens. War stops being only about battles and starts being about what armies do to civilians, to prisoners, to cities, and to truth itself. And the next chapter is one of the most notorious examples. Nanjing shows what discipline collapsed into. On December 13, 1937, Japanese forces capture Nanjing, then the capital of China, and the following weeks become a symbol of wartime atrocity. Historians debate numbers and scope, but they do not debate that widespread mass killing, looting, and sexual violence occurred, and that the scale was catastrophic. To understand why this becomes so infamous, picture a city where order has broken, where civilians try to hide in basements, where gunfire becomes background noise, and where foreign residents attempt to create safety zones with flags and paperwork, as if bureaucracy could stop bullets. Some witnesses record what they see. Some photographs survive. After the war, trials and testimonies turn the events into evidence. This chapter is not here to sensationalize pain. It is here because Nanjing reveals what happens when ideology, dehumanization, and permissive leadership meet the chaos of urban conquest. Atrocities are not just individual cruelty. They are also failure of command, and sometimes the result of a command culture that rewards aggression and punishes restraint. Nanjing also becomes part of a wider pattern in occupied areas, where civilians and prisoners live under constant threat. It hardens hatred, fuels resistance, and deepens the war's spiral. And in that spiral, the military also invests in a different kind of weapon, one that is built behind fences and laboratory doors. Unit 731 builds a lab. In the late 1930s, far from Japan's main islands, a secret world grows in occupied territory near Harbin, at Pingfang. It is associated with Unit 731 and with figures like Shiro Ishii, and it is tied to biological warfare research and to human experimentation, carried out with a level of cruelty that is still difficult to read about today. If you need a visual, do not think of dramatic battlefields. Think of sterile corridors, barred rooms, paperwork stamped and filed, and a facility that treats human beings as material. Prisoners are referred to with dehumanizing euphemisms. Experiments are designed to test disease, endurance, and the effects of exposure, and many victims do not survive. The point here is not gore. The point is how modernity can be twisted. This is not medieval violence. It is bureaucratic violence where science is used as a weapon and secrecy is the shield. Beyond the facility, there are allegations and historical debates around field use of biological agents and around outbreaks and testing tied to wartime operations. As the war turns against Japan in 1945, evidence is destroyed, buildings are burned, and the people involved try to disappear into the rubble. Afterward, parts of this story become tangled in Cold War politics, with accusations that some data was traded for leniency. Whatever the exact deals, the moral shape remains the same. A state built a laboratory that treated life as disposable, and that belongs in any honest account of the era. Captives, forced stations, and the march. War is not only fought by soldiers who choose it, it is also endured by prisoners, civilians, and people trapped inside systems designed to break them. In Japan's Imperial War, that includes forced labor networks, harsh POW conditions, and the system known by the euphemism comfort women, which many historians and institutions describe as organized sexual slavery tied to the military. The reason this matters is the same reason Nanjing matters. It shows structure. This is not only random misconduct. It is logistics, transport, control, and institutions that normalize abuse while hiding it behind paperwork and silence. One of the most vivid symbols on the Pacific side is the Bataan Death March. After the surrender on April 9, 1942, Tens of thousands of Filipino and American prisoners are forced to march under brutal conditions toward camps. Many collapse from hunger, dehydration, illness, and violence along the way. Later, commanders, including Masaharu Homa, are tried, and debates continue about knowledge, responsibility, and command culture. But the suffering of the prisoners is not in question. If you want a single image that connects these threads, picture long lines of exhausted men under the sun, then cut to a different room where officials assign people numbers, move them on lists, and call it administration. That is how cruelty scales. It becomes repeatable. This chapter also points to a key truth. Atrocities are not a national personality. They are the result of choices made by leaders, enforced by institutions, and tolerated by cultures of impunity. And the final chapter is about what happens when that machine finally collapses. Surrender, trials, and the new Japan. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan's formal surrender is signed in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signs for the government, General Yoshijiro Umezu signs for the military, and Allied leaders sign in sequence. The ceremony is brief, but it is the end of an empire built through decades of expansion and war. Before that moment, the pressure has become unbearable. Cities are burned by air raids. Supply lines are cut. The Soviet Union enters the war against Japan in August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shock the world and accelerate surrender. The emperor's voice, broadcast to the public, becomes a historical rupture, a sacred symbol speaking about defeat. Then comes accountability, imperfect and contested, but real. Trials prosecute a number of leaders, including wartime Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who took office on October 18, 1941. Many victims across Asia watch these proceedings with a mix of hope and anger, because no set of verdicts can fully match the scale of what happened. The rebuilding of Japan is as dramatic as its rise. Occupation reforms reshape institutions. A new constitution emphasizes a different national path. On April 28, 1952, the Treaty of San Francisco takes effect and restores sovereignty, closing the legal chapter of occupation. Modern Japan becomes a technological powerhouse and a close ally of the West, but memory does not dissolve easily. Disputes over history and responsibility remain politically charged across East Asia. If this story has one takeaway, it is this: nations can change direction faster than people think, and they can also convince themselves that violence is necessary when it is really a choice, and choices always leave receipts. If you liked this video, hit subscribe for more like it, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next.